Ever wonder how a war can completely change a nation's destiny? Today on the American War, we're diving deep into the most pivotal moments of 1862, the year that turned the tide of the American Civil War. We'll explore the war strategies, the unexpected victories, and the sacrifices that shaped history. This video isn't just about battles, it's about what those battles teach us about leadership, resilience, and overcoming adversity. If you've ever felt challenged to face something bigger than yourself, you'll connect with these stories. Discover how great leaders made decisions in critical moments, and how those lessons can be applied to your life today. Want to know how the Union turned the tables? Or how the South held on even when everything seemed lost? Stick around until the end, because here you won't just learn about history, but also take away practical insights for your own life. Let's understand together how 1862 shaped the United States, and maybe even learn something that can shape your future. The year 1862 dawned on a landscape of uncertainty for the American Civil War. With a year of battles already in the books, it became clear that both sides had underestimated the scale of the conflict. The South, with its fierce determination and knowledge of the terrain, was putting up an impressive resistance. On the other hand, the North, while superior in resources, was feeling the weight of a war that demanded much more than just military might. The American War was far from a quick skirmish. It was a battle of endurance that tested bodies and spirits. Despite its industrial and population strength, the North faced difficulties that seemed inexplicable, given its strategic advantages. The battlefield wasn't just about numbers, but about planning, courage, and often pure luck. In 1862, this tension between expectations and realities began to shape the nature of the conflict. It's like a chess game, where the position looks promising, but the execution of each move reveals unexpected weaknesses. The Union, relying on the superiority of its forces, entered 1862, needing to rethink its war strategies. Meanwhile, the South continued to bet on fierce defense and the search for foreign alliances. This dynamic created a war chessboard that, for many historians, shows how strategic planning and execution are fundamental in prolonged conflicts. A practical lesson: never underestimate your opponent, whether in war, business, or any competition. There was, however, an element of emotional wear and tear that accompanied the battlefield. Human losses and the uncertainty of the future began to weigh heavily on both soldiers and families. A clear example of this was the emotional impact on the Northern troops, who began to question their ability to overcome such a resilient enemy. This tension was a constant shadow, shaping military and political decisions. And so, 1862 emerged as a year of forced redefinition and learning for both sides. As the first victories and defeats began to take shape, it became clear that strategy alone would not be enough. But after all, how would the North begin to turn the tide? The battles that followed in 1862 hold some of the answers. After a year of relentless clashes, the American Civil War was already proving to be more brutal and prolonged than any initial predictions. Both the North and the South faced unexpected challenges that undermined their expectations of a quick resolution. The American War had transcended political disputes, transforming into a duel for survival. And like any conflict of this kind, there was no clear manual to guide the next steps. It was a territory of uncertainties. The North, despite its numerical and industrial superiority, encountered difficulties that defied its strategic logic. The vastness of the Confederate territories and local loyalty to the South created a difficult labyrinth to conquer. It wasn't enough to just dominate a region, it was necessary to maintain it, which demanded resources and energy in disproportionate amounts. This reality began to reveal a bitter truth. Brute force was not synonymous with victory. Meanwhile, the South, seemingly more fragile, proved adept at exploiting its advantages. Knowledge of the terrain, combined with a remarkable ability to adapt, allowed the Confederate Army to resist even in the face of adverse circumstances. This defensive war strategy, combined with the effective use of local troops, gave the South an unexpected respite. For those looking for practical lessons, this teaches that knowing the terrain well, whether literal or figurative, can be an advantage that outweighs resources. The wear and tear, however, was not just logistical but human. The growing casualties on both sides created an atmosphere of despair. Many soldiers, upon returning home, carried with them physical and emotional scars, which became indelible marks of this conflict. It is important to remember that, although the numbers are impressive in historical statistics, each soldier represented a family devastated by the war. From this chaotic scenario, 1862 began to be shaped by renewed attempts to turn the tide. The North, realizing the gravity of its failures, invested in new commanders and more aggressive strategies. But would these changes be enough? The first Union victories would soon give a clue. The beginning of 1862 brought the long-awaited first victories on the battlefield for the Union, something crucial to boost the morale of the troops and the population. The battles of Logan's Crossroads and Middle Creek, for example, not only gave a psychological boost to the Union Army, but also undermined Confederate influence in the strategic state of Kentucky. It was like watching a domino piece. Small victories at key points began to rebalance the chessboard of the American war. However, the Union's achievements did not stop there. The capture of Forts Henry and Donelson was a significant milestone. These victories guaranteed control over the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, opening an important corridor for the movement of troops and supplies. In strategic terms, it was like conquering a vital shortcut in a strategy game, a decision that put additional pressure on the Confederates and robbed them of the initiative. The impact of these victories echoed both on the battlefields and behind the political scenes. In the North, newspapers celebrated the successes, while Confederate leaders were forced to recalibrate their war strategies. These battles were not just clashes between armies. They were demonstrations of strength and military intelligence that began to reverse the tide of the conflict. For those who like to delve deeper, it is interesting to study the ability of commanders Ulysses S. Grant and Don Carlos Buell, whose actions were decisive in these moments. In addition, these victories brought to light the importance of rivers as transportation routes and strategic control. The Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, previously used by the Confederates, now became Union tools to expand their presence in the South. This example reminds us that in war and in life, mastering the access routes can be the difference between success and failure. However, the initial Union victories were just a beginning. There was still much ground to conquer and challenges to face. If the Confederates were weakened, they were also more determined. And this Southern resistance would soon be put to the test with the Union advances and Confederate tenacity that would mark the following months. With the first victories in 1862, the Union began to intensify its offensives, making the most of its strategic advantage. The coastal campaign, led by General Ambrose Burnside, stood out as a milestone of these advances. The capture of Roanoke Island consolidated the North's dominance over the coast of North Carolina, disrupting vital Confederate supply routes. This success was a clear example of how control of coastal areas can weaken an enemy dependent on maritime trade. Meanwhile, in the heart of American territory, the Battle of Pea Ridge in March 1862 brought a surprising feat. Despite initially being at a numerical disadvantage, the Union emerged victorious, securing control over Missouri and parts of Arkansas. This strategic victory showed how careful planning and courage on the battlefield can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Imagine being in a position where everything seems lost and, even so, turning the tide. That's exactly what this battle represented. But not everything was a bed of roses for the Union. Internally, General George McClellan, known for his excessive caution, faced harsh criticism for his slowness. During the Peninsula Campaign, his hesitation to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital, brought frustration to the Northern leadership. Here, the lesson is clear. While prudence can be a virtue, too much of it can become an obstacle. Acting decisively at the right time is an essential skill, both in war and in any field of life. On the other hand, the South demonstrated impressive resilience. Despite territorial losses, Confederate resistance remained firm, exploiting its local advantages and the motivation of its troops. For many Confederate soldiers, the fight was more than a military confrontation. It was a matter of cultural and territorial survival. This determination, although admirable, prolonged the conflict and made each Union victory more difficult to achieve. Thus, the Union advances found a constant test in Confederate resistance. Each step forward seemed to be followed by unexpected challenges, shaping a year of intense fighting. On the horizon, even more cruel battles would begin to define the course of the conflict. The next, Shiloh, would leave deep marks. The spring of 1862 brought devastating battles that redefined the intensity of the American Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh, fought in April, stood out as one of the most brutal clashes to date, with more than 23,000 casualties in just 2 days. Although the Union claimed victory, the high human cost shook both sides. For many, Shiloh represented a bitter awakening, The American War was not just about territories but about sacrifices that would mark generations. In the same month, another significant achievement lifted spirits in the North, the capture of New Orleans. This event guaranteed the Union control of a strategic point on the Mississippi River, essential to divide the Confederate territories. Under the leadership of Admiral David Farragut, this victory showed the importance of naval power in a land conflict. It is a lesson that echoes to this day. Never underestimate the impact of complementary forces in a larger strategy. However, the war was not made only of successes for the Union. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson showed the power of mobility and cunning in the Shenandoah Valley campaign. His quick and efficient offensive frustrated the North's plans, demonstrating that a smaller but well-commanded army can tip the scales in its favor. For those facing challenges in life, the lesson here is clear. Acting decisively and creatively can make all the difference even in situations of disadvantage. These mixed successes highlighted the complexities of 1862. While the Union advanced on some fronts, others seemed to escape its control. The psychological impact of these battles was no less significant than the territorial gains. Exhausted troops, fearful civilians, and pressured leaders contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty that permeated both sides. The war was as mental as it was physical. And so 1862 continued with an intense and unpredictable rhythm. Each battle seemed to redefine the limits of suffering and courage, preparing the ground for even more significant confrontations. Among them, the Battle of Antietam would emerge as a watershed in the conflict, both for the bloodshed and for the political decisions that would accompany it. The Battle of Antietam was one of the most significant moments of the American Civil War, etched in history as the bloodiest single-day engagement. With over 22,000 casualties in just 24 hours, the battlefield became a scene of tragedy and heroism. For the Union, this victory represented a crucial milestone, as it managed to stop the Confederate invasion of Northern Territory. However, the human cost was so high that, for many, victory seemed almost indistinguishable from defeat. General George McClellan, known for his strategic slowness, this time managed to use the advantage of military intelligence by intercepting Confederate plans. Even so, hesitation to fully seize the opportunity left many critics dissatisfied. Imagine getting the chance to completely neutralize your opponent and hesitating. That's what McClellan did, allowing Robert E. Lee's forces to retreat to the south. The lesson? In the battles of life, sometimes, acting fast can be more important than acting perfectly. For the Confederate side, Antietam was an attempt to show strength and gain international support, but the inevitable retreat undermined this ambition. The United Kingdom and France, who were closely watching the unfolding of the American War, kept their distance, realizing the fragility of the South after this strategic defeat. It is a powerful reminder that in war or diplomacy, appearances of strength are as important as results on the battlefield. Politically, Antietam gave Abraham Lincoln the victory needed to launch the Emancipation Proclamation, a decision that transformed the course of the conflict. It was no longer just a territorial war, but also a moral struggle for the abolition of slavery. This solidified internal support from the North and destabilized the Confederate forces, who now faced an enemy with an even clearer purpose. It's like turning a challenge into a strategic opportunity, something Lincoln knew how to do masterfully. While the Battle of Antietam was decisive in many ways, the conflict was far from over. The end of 1862 still held events that would test the Union's determination and Confederate resilience. Fredericksburg would be one of those moments, showing that the war still had many twists and turns in store. The Emancipation Proclamation, announced by Abraham Lincoln after the Battle of Antietam, was a watershed moment in the American Civil War. Until then, the war was mainly seen as a territorial and political dispute. With this measure, Lincoln radically changed the focus of the conflict, transforming it into a moral crusade against slavery. This energized the North, especially the abolitionists, and weakened the South, which now faced not only an army, but an idea that threatened its economic and social foundations. The Confederate reaction was immediate and forceful. Jefferson Davis, president of the South, denounced the proclamation as an attempt to incite slave revolts, which generated additional internal tensions. The fear of slave uprisings became a constant concern on Southern farms, diverting resources and attention from the front lines. For the Confederates, the war now seemed more personal and more threatening, further intensifying their resistance. Militarily, the impact of the proclamation was felt both inside and outside the United States. Lincoln's decision solidified the support of populations in countries that had already abolished slavery, such as the United Kingdom. Although these countries still maintained formal neutrality, the morality of the issue made it almost impossible for them to openly support the South. It's a practical example of how a narrative shift can transform not only the battlefield, but also global alliances. However, not everything was a triumph for the Union at the end of 1862. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December was an absolute disaster for the Northerners. Commanded by Ambrose Burnside, the Union troops faced a crushing defeat against well-positioned Confederate forces. This failure resulted in a wave of criticism of Lincoln's government and a dramatic drop in Army morale. It's a bitter reminder that even strategically brilliant leaders face devastating setbacks. And so, 1862 ended with a sense of uncertainty. Despite major political and symbolic advances, the war was still far from a resolution. With both sides exhausted but determined, the next year promised to be as intense and unpredictable as the previous one. After all, as history has shown, in times of war, nothing is guaranteed. Now that you know the crucial moments of 1862, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Can you see the lessons of leadership, strategy, and resilience that can transform the way you face challenges? Think about how these historical examples can help you make bolder decisions, face adversity, or even inspire those around you. Which of these battles caught your attention the most? Do you think you would have made the same decisions as the leaders of that time? Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to know how this story resonates in your life. And if you want to continue exploring the secrets and lessons of American wars, subscribe to the American War channel now. Activate the bell so you don't miss any content and embark with us on this fascinating journey through history. The next chapter is coming and you won't want to miss it.